My name is Annette McGivney. I'm the author of the book Pure Land, a story of 3 lives, 3 cultures, and the search for heaven on earth. Pure Land started when I was working on a story for Backpacker magazine, where I'm Southwest editor. A woman named Tomomi Hanamura was hiking to Havasu Falls at the bottom of the Grand Canyon on the Havasupai Reservation, and in May of 2006 she was murdered. Her killer was an 18-year-old Havasupai boy named Randy West Kogami, and at the time Randy was addicted to meth, and Tomomi's murder received a lot of publicity. She was stabbed 29 times. It was a really violent, tragic incident, and I covered that story for Backpacker magazine to look into what was happening at a really popular hiking destination. And at the time I was covering the story, the law enforcement thought the case was going to go to trial, and so there was a lot of information that was withheld about Tomomi and also about Randy. And what I wanted to know was, how could something so terrible happen in such a beautiful place? And what was she looking for on that day when she hiked there? After the story was published and Randy was charged and tried and sentenced to life in prison, I was able to get the information about Tomomi and Randy and the case, and that started to grow into a book that is Pure Land. And in my search to learn more about Tomomi, I wanted to know about her life in Japan and what her draw was to the West, and also what Randy's life was like on the Havasupai Reservation. And I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, where we see a lot of struggles with Native American cultures in the Southwest, and I was aware of what the Havasu people had been through in modern times, but I also looked into their history 100, 150, even 1,000 years ago, and what had shaped Randy as a person, and then what had shaped Tomomi as a person in her life in Japan. And she was really drawn to the West, to the dramatic landscapes of the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Yosemite. It was her whole life's mission was to visit those places and spend time in nature. And Randy, ironically, was cut off from the land. He had a very violent childhood that was filled with a lot of crime on the reservation, and he spent a lot of time in juvenile corrections in the state of Arizona, and so he didn't actually get to be in the Grand Canyon and visit the places that Tomomi did and connect with the landscape in the way she did. And so ultimately I ended up going to Japan and staying with Tomomi's family and learning about her there from her father and her cousins and her friends. And Tomomi's father gave me Tomomi's journal, in which she'd written in English about her travels. And when I came back from Japan, I started retracing Tomomi's steps across the West and visiting with the people that she had visited with. And so I went and interviewed them, and she not only was drawn to the landscapes of the West, but also to the native cultures of the land, the indigenous people and their connections to this geography that so many people know as our national parks, but before they were national parks, they were the indigenous homes for tribes, including the Havasupai tribe. I learned about her travels, and I learned more about Randy's history. And the deeper I got into the sadness that Tomomi carried about her childhood and Randy's upbringing in a very violent home, it brought up things for me in my own past and my own childhood. I grew up in a very affluent area in East Texas. My father was a doctor, but he was also abusive, and I had kept a lot of that buried in my subconscious. And this research into Tomomi's history and Randy's history brought up my own childhood trauma. And so the third person, the 3 lives, includes me, so Tomomi, Randy, and myself, and impacts of family violence. And I also look into how connections to nature, which is something that Tomomi and I shared, can heal trauma, especially childhood trauma. And Tomomi really inspired me in her journal as she wrote about her connection to the landscape, to walk that same path that she walked and to find healing and spiritual connection with the land. And ultimately, that's my version of heaven, and that's heaven on earth. One that made me really happy to write was of Tomomi on her journey when she was coming from southern Utah and driving down to the Grand Canyon. And she drove down this road called the Moki Dugway in southern Utah, and it's this massive set of steep switchbacks, and she wrote about it in her journal, and she did it. It's a dirt road. There's no guardrails. Most people turn around. They think it's too dangerous to drive. And Tomomi drove it with the windows down, and she took pictures of her dog, Blues, with his head hanging out the window. And I could just picture that, and I loved writing about it. Pure Land is not just a book, it's a cause, and the cause is to raise awareness about the effects of family violence and how being in nature can heal trauma and hopefully end family violence for children that are affected by it. And so as part of my efforts with this book, I've started a nonprofit called the Healing Lands Project. It's a partnership with myself and the profits from the book and the outfitter based in Flagstaff, Arizona called Grand Canyon Youth, and then Northern Arizona University's Family Violence Institute. And so we take children from the Family Violence Institute on wilderness river trips and allow those kids to connect to the natural world. And it's called a trauma-informed river trip because we have the children's social workers and caseworkers and the clinical director for the Family Violence Institute on the river trip. And we actually do therapy in the field to help the kids find support with a community of similar children who've also experienced violence and also connect with the natural world, perhaps for the first time in their lives. And so I'm really grateful for all the generosity of people that have contributed to the Healing Lands Project, and I am going to be going on the first river trip. We're going to get to take 12 kids on the river and hopefully share healing with them. And you can find out more about the nonprofit at IamPureLand.com.